I used to believe I was doing everything right. Every morning, every night, brush, floss, rinse. That final step, the mouthwash, felt like the seal of a perfect routine. That sharp, minty burn gave me a sense of certainty, like I was killing everything that shouldn't be there. And yet, something didn't add up, because even after all that effort, there were still signs. Subtle, but persistent. Breath that didn't stay fresh for long. Gums that felt slightly tender. That occasional trace of blood when brushing, easy to ignore, but impossible to fully dismiss. It didn't make sense. If the routine was correct, why weren't the results? That question lingered in a way that felt different from typical health concerns, because this wasn't about laziness or neglect. I wasn't skipping steps. I wasn't using inferior products. I was doing exactly what dentists recommended, what advertisements promised would work, what everyone else seemed to accept as the standard of good oral hygiene. And still, the problems persisted. I found myself analyzing each step of my routine, trying to identify where I might be going wrong. Was I brushing for the full 2 minutes? Yes. Was I flossing correctly? I believed so. Was I using quality products? Absolutely. I'd invested in electric toothbrushes, specialized floss, and premium mouthwash that cost 3 times what the generic brands did. So where was the breakdown? That question stayed with me longer than I expected, because the more I paid attention, the more I realized this wasn't just happening to me. So many people follow the same steps, trust the same products, and still deal with the same lingering issues. I started noticing it in conversations. Friends mentioning their gums bleeding during cleanings. Colleagues constantly chewing gum to mask breath concerns. Family members dealing with recurring sensitivity despite impeccable hygiene habits. All of us doing the right things. All of us getting incomplete results. And the standard response was always the same. Try a different toothpaste, brush more thoroughly, use mouthwash more frequently. But what if the solution wasn't doing more of the same? What if it was recognizing that the approach itself had limitations? That's when the frustration starts to grow, not because you're not trying, but because you are. And despite that, something continues quietly in the background. Something that doesn't go away. There's a particular type of frustration that comes from invisible problems. If you could see bacteria colonizing your gum line, if you could watch inflammation developing in real time, you'd know exactly what to address, but you can't. You're left with indirect signals, symptoms that come and go, improvements that feel temporary, and the nagging sense that you're managing a problem rather than solving it. I remember standing in the oral care aisle of a pharmacy, staring at dozens of mouthwash options, tartar control, gum care, sensitivity relief, whitening, antibacterial, each bottle making promises about what it would eliminate, prevent, or enhance. And I realized I'd tried most of them over the years, rotating between brands when one stopped seeming effective, switching formulations when a new, advanced version appeared, chasing incremental improvements that never quite delivered lasting change. And that's where a deeper concern begins to take shape, because gum problems rarely stay small. What starts as mild sensitivity or occasional bleeding can evolve. Inflammation doesn't just disappear on its own. And bacteria, if not properly addressed, don't just stop. They adapt. They persist. This is what bothered me most once I started researching. The progression from healthy gums to gingivitis to periodontitis isn't dramatic. It's not like a cavity where you suddenly feel pain and no intervention is needed. It's a slow degradation, a gradual loss of tissue integrity, an incremental breakdown of the structures that support your teeth, and by the time it becomes obvious enough to force action, you're often dealing with damage that's difficult or impossible to fully reverse. That timeline terrified me more than acute pain ever could, because pain forces you to act, but slow, silent progression allows you to rationalize, to delay, to convince yourself it's not that serious yet. So I started questioning something I had never questioned before. What if the problem isn't the lack of effort, but the effectiveness of what I'm using? This was a paradigm shift that felt almost uncomfortable, because it meant acknowledging that the entire oral care industry, with its massive marketing budgets, its clinical-sounding terminology, its shelf after shelf of specialized products, might not have given consumers the complete picture. Not through malice necessarily, but perhaps through a combination of commercial interests, conventional thinking, and the challenge of communicating complex biological concepts to a mass market. What if that burning sensation, that instant freshness, isn't actually solving the root issue? That burning sensation had always been my signal of efficacy. The stronger the burn, the more convinced I was that the mouthwash was working, killing germs, destroying bacteria, sanitizing my entire oral cavity. But what if that sensation was just a sensation? A sensory experience designed to create the perception of effectiveness, while the actual biological impact was more limited than I'd assumed. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I'd been equating intensity with results. A common psychological trap, but one that doesn't necessarily align with how biology actually works. Because here's something that changed the way I saw everything. Many traditional mouthwashes are designed to freshen breath quickly, but not necessarily to penetrate deeply into the areas where harmful bacteria actually thrive. This was the insight that unraveled my entire understanding of oral care. Breath freshness is largely about neutralizing volatile sulfur compounds, the gases produced by certain bacteria that create unpleasant odors. And yes, mouthwash accomplishes this effectively, for a short window of time. But the bacteria producing those compounds aren't primarily floating freely in your saliva. They're organized into biofilms attached to tooth surfaces, particularly along and below the gum line. These biofilms, commonly called plaque, are structured communities of bacteria protected by a sticky matrix that makes them remarkably resistant to simple rinsing. When you swish mouthwash for the recommended 30 seconds, you're hitting the surface of these biofilms. You might disrupt some of the loosely attached bacteria, you might temporarily reduce the bacterial count in your saliva, but the established colonies, the ones entrenched in the protected spaces between gum and tooth, the ones actively producing the inflammatory compounds that damage tissue, those remain largely undisturbed. They create a temporary effect, a surface-level cleanliness, but beneath that, the environment that allows bacteria to grow may still be there. This explained so much about my experience, the fresh feeling that faded within an hour, the recurring symptoms despite consistent use, the sense that I was never quite getting ahead of the problem. I wasn't addressing the root cause. I was managing symptoms in a cycle that never led to genuine resolution. And the more I understood about bacterial biofilms and the limitations of conventional mouthwash, the more frustrated I became that this information wasn't common knowledge. How many people were in the same position I'd been in, believing they were doing everything right, confused about why problems persisted, unaware that the tools they'd been given were incomplete. And once that idea settles in, it's hard to ignore, because suddenly all those recurring signs start to make sense. The cycle, the temporary relief, followed by the same symptoms, returning again and again. It wasn't personal failure, it wasn't bad genetics or inevitable aging. It was a logical consequence of using an approach that addressed symptoms superficially while the underlying conditions remained unchanged. That realization was both frustrating and liberating. Frustrating because it meant years of effort had been misdirected. Liberating because it meant the problem was solvable. I just needed a different approach. That's when I came across something unexpected. Not new, just overlooked. An approach that has existed for centuries, long before modern oral care products became the norm. Something simple, but studied, observed, and increasingly revisited for how it interacts with the oral environment in a completely different way. I encountered oil pulling almost by accident. A passing reference in an article about traditional medicine, mentioned alongside other practices I'd heard of but never seriously considered. My initial reaction was dismissal. It sounded like folk remedy territory, something people did before modern science provided better solutions. But I kept seeing it referenced, not just in wellness blogs or alternative health sites, but in actual research publications, studies examining its effects on plaque accumulation, gingivitis markers, bacterial populations. The scientific interest in this ancient practice was growing, and that combination, traditional use over centuries plus modern research validation, created just enough credibility to overcome my skepticism. Certain natural oils, used correctly, don't just mask odors. They interact with the biofilm in your mouth. They create conditions that make it harder for harmful bacteria to remain active and multiply. The mechanism made immediate sense once I understood it. Oils are lipophilic. They're attracted to fats and lipids. Bacterial cell membranes are made of lipids. When you swish oil thoroughly through your mouth for an extended period, you're creating sustained contact between the oil and these bacterial membranes. The oil doesn't destroy bacteria through chemical warfare the way antiseptics do. Instead, it binds to bacterial cells, disrupting their attachment to surfaces and to each other. It mechanically pulls bacteria out of biofilms and suspends them in the oil, which you then spit out. But here's the crucial difference. This process is selective. Research on coconut oil specifically, which contains high levels of lauric acid and other medium-chain fatty acids, has shown antimicrobial effects against pathogenic oral bacteria while being less disruptive to beneficial bacterial strains. It's not about creating a sterile environment. It's about shifting the balance. It's not about intensity. It's about interaction. This represented a fundamentally different philosophy than conventional mouthwash. Instead of a shock and awe approach, kill everything, kill it fast, create immediate sensory confirmation, oil pulling operates through sustained, gentle, selective pressure. You're not overpowering the bacterial ecosystem. You're modulating it, creating conditions that favor beneficial bacteria and make it difficult for pathogenic strains to maintain their dominance. The time component is essential. Traditional practice recommends 15-20 minutes of swishing, which sounds excessive compared to 30 seconds of mouthwash. But that extended contact time is precisely what allows the oil to penetrate biofilms, bind to bacterial cells, and mechanically remove them from protected niches that brief rinsing can't reach. And that difference changes everything. Instead of a quick rinse that's gone in seconds, this method works more gradually, more thoroughly, reaching areas that are often missed, supporting the balance of the oral microbiome rather than just trying to overpower it. I decided to try it for 2 weeks before forming a judgment. Coconut oil specifically, organic, unrefined, the kind I already had in my kitchen for cooking. The first morning was awkward. A tablespoon of coconut oil, solid at room temperature, melting in my mouth, the unfamiliar texture, the weird sensation of swishing oil instead of liquid. But I committed to the full 20 minutes while going through my morning routine, showering, getting dressed, preparing breakfast. The time passed more easily when I wasn't just standing there focused on the swishing. And the more I looked into it, the more it became clear this isn't about replacing one product with another randomly. It's about understanding how different approaches actually work. Why some only offer short-term effects, while others aim to influence the root of the problem. By day 3, I'd adjusted to the routine. The oil no longer felt foreign in my mouth. I could swish comfortably while multitasking, and I started noticing subtle changes. My mouth felt different in the morning, not just fresh, actually clean. That coating I used to wake up with, the one that made morning breath inevitable regardless of how well I'd brushed the night before, was noticeably reduced. By day 7, the changes were more pronounced. My gums looked less inflamed. The slight puffiness I'd accepted as normal had decreased, and when I brushed, there was no trace of blood, something that had been a regular occurrence despite gentle brushing technique. By the end of 2 weeks, I was convinced the persistent tenderness in certain areas of my gums had resolved. The sensitivity to cold drinks that had been bothering me for months had improved dramatically, and my breath stayed genuinely fresh throughout the day, not masked by mint but actually absent of the bacterial byproducts that create odor. But the most significant change was psychological. I no longer felt like I was managing symptoms. I felt like I was actually addressing the underlying condition. That shift from reactive to proactive, from coping to healing, was profound. Because for anyone who's tired of repeating the same routine without seeing real improvement, this shift in perspective can be the turning point. I started sharing my experience with friends who'd mentioned similar oral health frustrations. The responses were mixed. Some were immediately interested, others were skeptical, as I had been. A few tried it and reported back with positive results. But what struck me was how many people resonated with the core frustration, doing everything right according to conventional wisdom, yet not seeing the results they expected. That disconnect between effort and outcome, between following the rules and achieving the goal, was nearly universal. And it suggested that the problem wasn't individual failure, it was a systemic gap in how oral health is typically approached and communicated. And if you've ever felt that quiet concern that something deeper might be going on beneath the surface, you're not imagining it. Inflamed gums, persistent bad breath, recurring sensitivity, these are signals, not just inconveniences. Signals that something in the environment of your mouth needs to change. This is what conventional approaches often miss. They treat symptoms as isolated problems to be suppressed rather than as information about underlying conditions that need to be addressed. Bleeding gums aren't just annoying, they're evidence of inflammation. Persistent bad breath isn't just a social concern, it's a sign of bacterial imbalance. Sensitivity isn't just discomfort, it's an indication that protective structures have been compromised. When you start viewing these symptoms as data rather than nuisances, your entire approach changes. You stop asking, how can I make this symptom go away? And start asking, what is this symptom telling me about what my body needs? And that's exactly where this method stands out. By focusing on how bacteria survive and what disrupts that survival, you're no longer just reacting. You're addressing the cause. The science behind oil pulling continues to develop, but what we know so far is compelling. Studies have shown reductions in plaque accumulation, gingivitis, markers, streptococcus, mutans counts, the primary bacteria associated with tooth decay, bleeding on probing overall bacterial load in saliva, and these aren't marginal effects. Some studies have shown oil pulling to be as effective as chlorhexidine mouthwash, a prescription-strength antimicrobial for certain markers, but without the side effects chlorhexidine is known for: staining, altered taste perception, and disruption of normal oral flora. In a way that feels simple, but is actually grounded in real observations and growing scientific interest. The traditional wisdom that sustained this practice for thousands of years is now being validated by modern research methods. And that convergence of ancient empirical observation and contemporary scientific rigor creates a compelling foundation. This isn't about rejecting modern dentistry or embracing every natural remedy uncritically. It's about being discerning, about evaluating what actually works based on both traditional use and scientific evidence, rather than assuming that commercial, fast, effective. Because the goal isn't to complicate your routine, it's to make it smarter, to move away from temporary fixes, and towards something that actually helps restore balance, reduce inflammation, and give you back that sense of control over your own health. One of the most appealing aspects of oil pulling is its simplicity. You don't need to buy specialized products. You don't need to learn complex techniques. You don't need to add multiple steps to your routine. Just coconut oil, or sesame oil, another traditional option, 20 minutes, and consistency. The barrier to entry is remarkably low. The cost is minimal. A jar of coconut oil that lasts for months costs less than a single bottle of premium mouthwash. And the integration is seamless. You can do it while doing other things, so it doesn't require dedicating additional time to oral care beyond what you're already spending. And once you understand that, everything changes. You stop chasing symptoms and start understanding them. You stop relying on what feels strong and start choosing what actually works. And most importantly, you realize that taking care of your gums isn't about doing more. It's about doing what truly makes a difference. I haven't used conventional mouthwash in months now. The bottles under my sink remain untouched, artifacts of an approach I no longer need. Oil pulling has become as automatic as brushing my teeth. 20 minutes every morning while I go through my routine. No thought required, no willpower needed, just a habit that sustained itself through the results it produces. My gums are healthier than they've been in years. The chronic low-grade inflammation that I'd accepted as normal has resolved. My dental hygienist commented on the improvement during my last cleaning, noting reduced plaque and healthier tissue. And perhaps most importantly, I've regained a sense of agency over my oral health. I'm not dependent on commercial products that provide temporary relief. I'm not caught in a cycle of recurring problems despite consistent effort. I'm using a method that addresses root causes, that works with my body's natural processes rather than against them, that's supported by both traditional use and modern research. So if this made you rethink something you've been doing every single day, stay with me, because this is just the beginning of uncovering what really works and why. Subscribe to the channel and let's keep exploring the kind of knowledge that doesn't just inform, it transforms. The conversation about oil pulling opens the door to broader questions about how we approach health in general, about the difference between symptom suppression and actual healing, about the value of traditional practices that have stood the test of time versus newer commercial solutions that promise results but often deliver only temporary management. These aren't academic questions, they're practical ones that affect your daily life, your long-term health, and your sense of control over your own well-being. And the more you explore these questions, the more you realize how much valuable knowledge has been marginalized or forgotten in favor of solutions that are more profitable to sell but not necessarily more effective to use. Oil pulling is one example, but it's part of a larger pattern of rediscovering and validating traditional health practices that modern research is increasingly confirming. The challenge is filtering through the noise, distinguishing evidence-based traditional practices from pure pseudoscience, separating what actually works from what's merely marketed effectively. That's the journey we're on together. Exploring practices that have legitimate foundations, understanding the mechanisms behind them, and applying them in ways that produce real, measurable improvements. Your oral health is just the starting point, because once you experience the difference between superficial symptom management and genuine root cause resolution, you can't help but ask what else might be approached differently. What other aspects of health have you been managing rather than healing? What other routines are you following out of habit rather than effectiveness? What other conventional wisdoms are worth questioning? These questions lead to discoveries, and those discoveries lead to transformations, not dramatic overnight changes, but sustainable improvements that compound over time, that shift you from reactive to proactive, that restore the sense that your health is something you actively influence rather than passively experience. That's what this channel is about, not just information, but transformation. Not just knowing more, but doing better. So stay with me, because we're just getting started.